All right, class, I am going to talk you through cultivating and growing edible mushrooms, something I am very passionate and excited about, and something that I think is interesting, and I hope you do too. So today I'm going to talk about the types of edible mushrooms that are most commonly cultivated. I'll describe the process of selecting a genetic material for you to use and grow, and then generating something called grain spawn, which is grain spawn. I don't like to use equivalencies like calling it seed or calling it that. It's just grain spawn. It's on seed, but we'll get there. Talking about substrates, we'll go into different kinds of substrates, why they are used, and then highlight the different techniques for some of the most commonly produced and consumed types of edible fungi. Okay, we'll talk about fruiting chambers, and Dr. Robbins somewhere is sad that I'm using the word fruiting, but in the vegetable horticulture side of it, fruiting bodies and fruit is often used referring to mushrooms instead of like a basidiocarp or something like that. But if you've watched the life cycle video, you'll understand what I mean. And then I'll talk about the initiation and the fruiting of mushrooms, harvest and post-harvest. And then I'll talk just briefly about some of the pests that can be a problem for cultivating mushrooms. Okay, so this is pretty old now, but I got this data while I was in graduate school. But in 2016, the U.S. industry produced about almost $1 billion or 1 billion pounds of mushrooms, worth over $1.2 billion by this time. And 922 million pounds were agaricus. Now, agaricus is the genus of the typical button mushroom that you find, and those sell for about $1.19 a pound wholesale. But this specialty mushroom part is a big part of the growing fungi as food industry. $95 million in 2016, up from 65 in 6 years. And I would not be surprised if that 95 million has at least increased to 150% of that number. And a big part of that is this number here, that nearly $4 wholesale. And that's a wholesale bulk price. But when you consider small regional growers that can sell more directly to customers, you know, I was selling, when I sold at farmers markets, I sold about 4 to 8 ounces of mushroom, depending on the type, for anywhere from $6 to $12. So, I mean, the profit is there for sure. And that's part of why the industry is growing so much. I have this slide because I think people think of mushrooms sometimes as just this taste or just this experience, but they do have a lot of these nutritional or rather these mineral and vitamin elements to them that actually make them a pretty healthy food, and not just dried out and put in a pill for you to eat in your tea or your whatever. You know, I will withhold my opinion about that. But I will say that whole mushrooms consumed as a cooked product are filled with vitamins and other nutrients that are actually very, very good for you. A note on that, I will say I highly recommend that all mushrooms that you consume, even just your button mushrooms, you cook, because a lot of those compounds that give you a stomach ache from mushrooms or that people have allergies to break down when you cook them. I think it's important to recognize that you can be okay to eat button mushrooms and shiitakes make your stomach uncomfortable, or oysters particularly. Oysters are actually one of the most consumed types of mushroom that's a wild or this sort of gourmet mushroom, and those actually have a pretty high rate of people having some sort of reaction gastrointestinally to them. So always cook them, always use a small amount, even if it's a mushroom that you see at the grocery store every day. That's my pro tip. Okay, for any of the classes that I'm presenting this to, they will be very familiar with this. I only have this slide on here because if we look at how mushrooms grow and spread in the wild, we're going to be mimicking some of those environments or hacking some of those processes for our own benefit. You know, think about how there's hyphae and they spread, and the mycelium growth and the conditions under which those grow under the ground, etc. And then the conditions that cause these basidiocarp, the fruit, to come through the ground. So that's the reason I have this slide, but you all know that already. So again, just some quick refreshers. Fungi are heterotrophic. That is important. That's why we're talking about substrates. They're not autotrophs, and that their life cycles change in response to CO2 levels. Okay, that's something that's very important if we want to control when we get our mushrooms. Light's not required for all stages of growth. It's not required for any stages of growth, and we can manipulate the light and CO2 levels to change our end product, and we'll talk about that. Again, hyphae are this vegetative state. Again, coming from horticulture, I use words that aren't botany words, but that's okay. Anyway, spores germinate into hyphae, which form mycelium, and most of their life cycle is spent as this mycelium. Again, they form mushrooms when they're trying to reproduce. So again, this is not scientific, but I'm breaking up these general types of mushrooms into two categories because those two categories are going to dictate things down the road that you use to cultivate these mushrooms. Okay, so we've got forest mushrooms and field mushrooms. So forest mushrooms are things like oyster, shiitake, enoki, beech, and lion's mane mushrooms. Okay, that's these mushrooms and these are enoki. These are beech mushrooms. Okay, this is a lion's mane, or lobster mushrooms that go under there. And then field mushrooms, these are actually all just Garricus here, button, portobello, cremini. Another mushroom that's cultivated that falls under here, I'm not going to mention due to legal reasons, but I would consider it a field mushroom. Okay, so say you think, I want to grow mushrooms and I want it to be something I can do as a business. Here's some equipment you're going to want to start with. Okay, you're going to need an autoclave, something that can get you up to those high pressure, high temperatures where you can kill bacterial endospores and things like that. Okay, so a good old fashioned giant pressure cooker will work. That's what I used. I had a system of a pressure cooker for some of my products. We'll get into that. But there's also huge commercial autoclaves. This, I think, probably is a retrofitted canning pressure cooker. Okay, this isn't necessary, this laminar flow hood, but I will say I made a homemade little laminar flow hood, which if you were here and you were in class, I'd have my books and my flow hood and a bunch of other things that I keep in my office. If you want to see that, come by my office. So you can make a homemade flow hood, or you can buy one. The point is that there's a HEPA filter, and you're filtering out any of those microorganisms that are going to contaminate. I always say, like this right here, you see my arms, probably can't tell from the camera, but I have hair on my arms, like many of us. And that right there, as you move over your sterile spaces, is just contaminating it with every possible kind of microorganism you can imagine. So having this air blowing, mine was just a squirrel cage fan on top of the box with a HEPA filter in the front of it. That's it. But because of that, I never had any contamination loss in a single one of my crops or in any of my grain spawn unless I left it for an overextended period of time. And then we're going to talk about cropping containers as well as gloves, Tyvek. I had Tyvek sleeves that I put over my arms for aforementioned reasons, and face masks, things like that. Being sterile, your sterile procedure and following a strict procedure is the key to this feeling like growing a vegetable as opposed to being some complicated microbiological process. Okay, so did that skip one? Nope, it didn't. Okay, so and then finally you have some kind of chamber or space where you're taking this colonized by mycelium substrate and you are getting it to produce mushrooms. Okay, that can be some tiny little box here that I'm sure that person was using to grow oyster mushrooms or shiitakes. And this right here is a large-scale bag type operation. And then I've seen this done, and actually this is a really effective way. I had a shed in my backyard that I covered everything in plastic and insulated and had a misting system, and it was very off of eBay, rigged up. It did have fresh air. I had some electronic controls with some really basic computer programming, but it didn't cost me very much, and it worked really, really well. I grew in BYU ice cream buckets because they were 50 cents and I could reuse them. And they nested on top of each other so I could stack them 3 or 4 high. And the point is being able to control the environment so you have the humidity correctly and those CO2 levels right is the way that you can consistently produce mushrooms. It's one thing to grow some mushrooms and, hey, look, I grew some mushrooms. It's another thing. You know, I grew 40 pounds every single week. I harvested them either Friday night or Saturday morning, usually Saturday morning right before the farmer's market. And I took, I would say, between 20 and 40 pounds depending on the previous 2 weeks' demand. And I produced those every single week. And I wasn't super high tech at all. So it's possible. It's just following some of these steps I'll talk about. Okay, so Paul Stamets, great for ethnomycology and one of the greats on knowing how to grow mushrooms as far as his scientific publications. Ask Dr. Zahn. That said, this is true, and this is his 6 vectors of contamination. The cultivator, the air, the media you're growing in, whether that's agar to your substrate, the tools you're using, this is important, and then the inoculum, meaning your grain spawn or what we're going to talk about here, or mobile contamination units, bugs, mites, small mammals, which include and are not limited to your own children. Those are all things that can ruin it. Okay, so getting started, you're going to need, where do I get genetic material from? You can buy, like, see these syringes here? This is just pulled off the internet. These are not my spores, just to be clear, if you can read what's on those. But I have bought oyster mushrooms that way, shiitake mushrooms that way, and it's a really effective way, and you can inoculate a lot of grain spawn that way. This is a liquid culture where essentially you've got I used Caro syrup, but you've got a nutrient-rich solution that mycelium is suspended in and it grows in there. You can grow on agar. You can clone your favorite thing on agar there. You can also just get wild mushrooms and cut pieces off, and clone it on agar, or you can get wild mushrooms and make a spore print and then use those spores to inoculate almost any of this media type. So, okay, this is the same thing. Spore prints, like I said, and then there's something called plug spawn, which I would say this is viable or profitable or a decent way to do it on basically one type of operation that we'll talk about, which is a shiitake log operation, and we'll get into that. But essentially this is little wooden dowels that are spiral cut that have been inoculated and have mycelium growing all over them. You hammer them into a log. We'll get into that. Okay, so grain spawn. In large scale industry, it's very often rye grain for a variety of reasons. People use popcorn. It's something with this surface area that can be hydrated, okay? The process is you basically take this grain, you parboil it for a period of time, you let it steam off and dry down to a certain wetness, and then you put it in your jars and you excuse me, you then you sterilize in an autoclave or pressure cooker. And then from there, you're able to open it up in front of your laminar flow hood and put your syringe in. You can put your piece of agar in. You can then inoculate these jars, and we'll talk about that more in a second. This is an example of a jar of grain spawn that I did not tend very closely, so it just fruited right out of the top. I used to use purpose-built, specialized lids with injector tops, and they were fancy and they were expensive. And then I found that I could just drill the hole in the lid that they came with and put some poly batting in it, and I could inject right through that, and it still filtered out enough that I never had problems with it. But I say I never had problems with it, but this is the one problem that you would get, is it would push the poly batting out, or just suck it in and do whatever the mycelium is going to do. So yeah, if you look at this stuff under a microscope, I mean, the mycelium colonizes completely around the grain. It's pretty neat. Quart jars are most common. There's those fancy injectable lids. And then they'll have a filter lid under it sometimes, or again, the poly stuffing lid is cheap. And as long as you cover the tops of those with some foil in your pressure cooker or your autoclave, the condensation that's falling down won't go through your filter and destroy it. Okay, so then we talk about containers. So we've got our grain spawn, it's inoculated, it's totally colonized with mycelium for oyster mushrooms, and we want to grow it, okay? So then this is where the paths start to diverge between forest and field, as well as some of the different types of forest mushrooms. So let's assume we're growing oyster mushrooms, okay? And so those are typically grown in bags or tubs, or I told you I used buckets with holes cut in the side, something that can have the substrate packed in and sealed up, and then the mycelium can colonize the substrate, and then there's a little bit of, whether it's a plastic bag that you can snip open so that then the CO2 level drops, and again, we'll talk about that, but it's exposed to these different environmental conditions that initiate pinning and fruiting. So there's the poly tube, there's glass jars, those are beach mushrooms, and we'll talk about how they cultivate enoki mushrooms in a poly jar in a really specific way in Japan and some other places. Here's some buckets. This is off of a laundry basket. Okay. Now for agaricus and those field mushrooms, you're looking at typically in trays or bags or something shallow that has, and we'll talk about the substrate in a little bit, but the substrates for these are going to be some type of manure. In large commercial things, it's very often with chicken litter, sometimes with beef manure, but very often it's chicken litter because of how prevalent that is. Mixed with straw, allowed to sort of break down and digest, and then it's pasteurized and used. But we'll talk about substrates in a second. Right now, actually. So we've got, if we're talking about oyster mushrooms, they'll grow on jeans, they'll grow on palm fronds, they'll grow on old coffee, they'll grow on rice hulls, they'll grow on cotton trash. In Northwest Arkansas, Arkansas has pretty much every possible ag industry, and so we got to play with a lot of ag waste, and there's a lot of research into using different agricultural waste. One of the interesting things about coffee, for example, oyster mushrooms will colonize and grow on 100% of the coffee debris, and it will break down the caffeine that is in the coffee debris, and then caffeine contamination is no longer a downstream problem if you break it down that way. Same with palm oil. The sort of typical way is to go into a palm oil plantation for harvest and to just hack off fronds and stack them, and then rats and blood pythons move in, and that's fascinating, but outside the scope of this lesson. But mushrooms will grow there. Again, we've got rice hulls, wood logs, sawdust, manure, and straw. Although I would say wheat straw is, in large-scale cultivation of these mushrooms, if we're talking about oyster, probably your most common. And there are some niche production styles that I'm not going to talk about in depth. I might mention them after I've talked about everything, but I'm going over sort of the most common stuff. So here's some straw with my children smaller, and essentially my method was to take 50-gallon food-safe drum. I have one of those turkey fryers with a propane tank and a stand built out of concrete blocks. I would set it on there, I would fill it with water, and I would bring it up to a temperature, the pasteurization temperature between 160 and 180 degrees, and I would leave it there for about 1.5 to 2 hours with my straw that had been chopped up, again, create some surface area, break that apart, and then it's laid out on this sterilized, well, disinfected plastic, and then, excuse me, and then once it reaches 100 degrees, you take your grain spawn, which opening up some oyster mushroom grain spawn, this process smells so lovely. And you spread it out and you mix it in, and a kid could do it. And then you fill your container, like these buckets, or excuse me, like these bags or like your buckets, you fill that with your grain spawn and straw mixture, and then you sort of have finished that part of the process. So again, the straw is pasteurized, okay? You can get away with pasteurization, partly because you're going to be growing oyster mushrooms, and these oyster mushrooms colonize fast enough to overcome any of the microorganisms that didn't get killed in the pasteurization process. And straw contains fewer harmful microorganisms than some of the wood products we're about to talk about. This is for agaricus, same thing. It's composted, it's mixed with manure, like I said. It's cooled. It's really the same process, other than it has been mixed with these different types of chicken litter or something like that. You can see, this isn't a very great picture, but these are huge spaces where chicken litter and straw are mixed with a tractor and allowed to compost before they're then pasteurized. And they are often pasteurized in these long hallway. I would look it up if you're interested. It's sort of more than I want to get into right now, but the button mushroom production is fascinating. We have here in the state an awesome large-scale button mushroom production facility in Fillmore. Okay, so sawdust, excuse me. All right, so when we're talking about sawdust, and it's more than just sawdust, it's hardwood sawdust. I have it as preferred here, but it's pretty essential for successful yield. And it's supplemented with bran and gypsum, and it's also got some wood chips, okay? So chaff, AKA wood chips, this sawdust here, some gypsum, and some bran. And again, this is to supplement the nutrients. So some of our slow-growing guys like shiitake, this is primarily for shiitake, king oyster, some of these slow-growing and even more valuable types of mushroom products, okay? And it's absolutely necessary that they go through the sterilization process, not just of your grain spawn, but of the media as well. And that really puts limits on your production, because you can only fit so many bags of sawdust in a pressure cooker or in your autoclave. And so this is where some of the large-scale facilities really have an edge, is being able to utilize whatever their special mix of some kind of hardwood that they can then sterilize and inoculate. And then this is that log culture, and one of the things about this is you don't have to sterilize the logs, because you're drilling into whole logs, you're putting these plugs in, and these take between 3 and 12 months to produce. And this says with wax, and that's sort of what they recommend, but I've grown them with and without wax, and personally noticed no difference in them working out. But some people feel it's very important to cover it up with wax, again, because of those competing organisms. I think maybe it would be a regional thing, where there are areas of the world where it was important for you to seal that up. Anyways, so this is, and in Arkansas as well, there are farms that have been growing as a part of their produce log culture out in the forest that they're cutting down, so that they have cover and high humidity. They have acres of logs like this. It's really neat, and there's places in the world where outdoor log culture like this, because of the type of wood that they have and the environment, it's sort of tailor-made for that sort of thing. Okay, so we're looking we're talking about initiation or pinning, and so this is only going to happen after all of the substrate has been colonized by the mycelium, and the nutrients, the organism is starting to feel these effects of nutrient deprivation. The humidity is high, CO2 has dropped a little bit, and again, think of it this way. And there's also temperature increase and lighting. And the reason, if you look at all of these things, these are the kind of situations. Imagine you have mycelium working underground and they've sort of expanded through their nutrient source. And there are places where they are close to or through the soil surface. So you still have the humidity, you're out of nutrients, your CO2 drops because instead of producing CO2 through respiration like they do, they have come into contact with a higher oxygen-rich environment, and the CO2 drops. The temperature can often drop as they come, or increase as they leave the sort of standard, they're insulated there under the dirt, they come out, the temperature changes, and maybe they even have higher levels of light that can then be promoting this primordial pinning formation. So again, this is us copying or replicating or hijacking or whatever you want to say, the natural process that exists that causes these fungi to respond to environmental conditions and produce reproductive structures. And then for general fruiting or creation of mushrooms, you're looking at cooler temperatures, lower humidity. Again, you consider that this is, in nature, they're growing above the ground, and the humidity is lower. The CO2, they're completely exposed to the environmental oxygen. And this higher CO2 level can actually cause the stalk or stems, as I wrote here, but again, that's not a botanical word, to elongate. And we want that sometimes, we'll talk about that. And then light requirements similar to that primordia formation for those species. And then, let's see here, same with low light conditions. Some stems can elongate without that. And this is a tip as we're going into some of the specifics about species. There's going to be a lower range listed for humidity. This is more of a post-harvest tip. If you can keep the humidity in those lower ranges, you're going to have a longer shelf life, because if the wetter they are when you harvest them, the higher humidity in the environment, the shorter their shelf life, particularly with some of the short shelf life species like oyster mushrooms. Okay, so I'm going to just kind of cruise through these pretty quick. I included a bunch of oyster types to illustrate that if you look here, you've got low temperatures. You've got 50 degrees for pinning and 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit for fruit body development. Something to consider there is that, look around you. I had a species that I harvested off a log in my yard when I was doing this that would produce mushrooms in the 50s. It would be 55 degrees. So I saved that for myself. And in cooler weather, I grew that and lowered my heating bills because they were very comfortable creating big, dark brown, beautiful oyster mushrooms right at this temperature, okay? So, and again, I will leave this here. This is all information from Growing Gourmet and Medicinal Mushrooms by Stamets. And I actually found this to be very valuable. Now, I did get to the point where maybe I realized I didn't have to have a CO2 meter and a lux meter or whatever to really get these things dialed in. You realize that these numbers more represent high humidity, low humidity, high temperatures, low temperatures, and they begin to be part of just you understanding how to grow the mushrooms. But then we've got these pink oysters, very popular in tropical environments, and they are very pink, depending on the strain you get. But these grow in very warm environments compared to the others. And I would say that this 70 to 85 is 85, 90, 95. And we'll talk about some, like Phoenix oyster that's from India, and they generally, I grew them at almost 100 degrees, or popcorn oyster, in my little shed sometimes, and I never had issues with them. The issue was the hotter they were, the harder it was for me to run my timing because I got ready too early. This is that popcorn oyster with these high temperatures. That Phoenix oyster I was talking about. Okay, this is my favorite mushroom to eat. I think it's the most delicious. I think it's the most exciting. And it is a pleurotus, an oyster mushroom species. However, this mushroom is a slower growing, much more similar to growing a shiitake mushroom. Okay, and this is looking at, you're gonna get like one big fat mushroom if you try to grow this on straw. The nutrient needs of these lean much more towards needing to be grown in that sawdust and the enriched sawdust mixture I talked about, the wood chips and the gypsum and the bran. And again, there are strains of these that grow warmer and cooler, but they're typically a little bit more of a spring, fall, cooler temperature, higher humidity type of mushroom. And I've seen them grown in bottles, I've seen them grown in bags. I do like the bottle culture for ease of harvest, and for density if you've got the space. This is how I grew them, is I grew them on just in my quart jars. Okay, shiitake mushrooms. See, one of the things to consider is with these oyster mushrooms, you're talking about from being inoculated to being produced 30 days, 6 weeks, depending, especially the warmer season. Popcorn oyster was like 30 days, 34 days, whereas the cooler temperature oysters were closer to 6, maybe even 8 weeks sometimes. And again, that's going to be so dependent on you, your environment, and the strain you choose. Whereas shiitake mushrooms, depending on best case scenario, if you're doing bag culture and you're hitting all your marks and you get a really aggressively growing species, because they do sell them now where they develop at the 85-degree range, and those are actually pretty quick. But then they have them that are again in this 40 to 50 range. I don't have that listed, but if you go online, they sell just about every strain. People have found these strains that work in their environments. But anyways, these are going to take 3, 4, 6 months depending on the type. And then if they're in logs like this, they can be a year, 18 months. And if you're growing on logs, you got to time, okay, when the mycelium have colonized this log, are the outdoor temperatures going to be conducive to growing these mushrooms? So a lot more planning there. Now with shiitake mushrooms, one of the things that you can do, if you've ever seen them where the caps look cracked and craggly and sort of like that lava texture, is that the humidity is dialed way back, almost completely gone for the last probably 12 to 18 hours, and the caps tighten up and then crack. So, and the size you harvest them at is totally depending on your market. Oyster mushrooms, people have kind of taken at every size. King oysters, they want big fat guys so they can cut them into things and bread them and make vegan type of recipes, or not vegan, but very popular meat substitute. Whereas these, it's funny, here in the US we want as big as we can get, but in Japan and China, Vietnam, the smaller caps are desirable. So lion's mane mushroom is really fun to grow. It's really rewarding. It's super delicate. Transporting it even in super padded coolers, it gets bruised very easily because of the, you can see this kind of delicate structure. It's a definite forest mushroom. You will see these out growing here in Utah, up in Big Cottonwood, Little Cottonwood, American Fork Canyon, anywhere, if you hike long enough and look at the right temperatures. These grow slowly. They're a pretty significant investment for a low volume weight, but when people want them, they want them, and I always sold every one of them that I brought, but for me it's still, I transitioned out of these because they just didn't make financial sense for my operation. Okay, this is that enoki mushroom. Okay, Flammellina velatupes, this guy right here, is then taken and they put these collars around them and they deprive them completely of light so no pigmentation develops. And this collar causes a concentration of CO2 right at that place where the primordia forms, the pinning happens. And so they grow into these elongated, very tender, very soft, and very mild tasting mushrooms. These are actually delicious and are here in Utah. That said, they're very LBM, little brown mushrooms, so don't just harvest something that looks kind of like this picture. Be very careful about harvesting wild mushrooms. Beach mushrooms, very popular in Asia, very popular to grow in that bottle culture where they're grown very tightly packed in these little bottles. And again, you can see this has been dried down, so the caps have that crackled type of top. They're cooler weather typically. Again, think of when you see mushrooms in your day-to-day life. They're in the spring, they're in the fall, they're not in the hot summer, with exception, obviously. Okay, and then button mushrooms, I won't get into lots of detail with them. They do have some differences. Where they spawn, they are grown without light. You know, I grew up being told that mushrooms grow in caves and cow dung. And originally that kind of was the case, and that low light, lower temperature, high humidity environment is what these like for their entire process. Lower CO2 requirements throughout. These are sort of unique, and they really aren't, they don't fall under that gourmet mushroom, in my opinion, that we're talking about. So, portobello mushrooms are just a trade name. They sometimes during the harvesting process, a few of the caps get missed, and then the bags, the big bags they use, or the big trays would get set aside, and they wouldn't get cleaned up right away. And so some of these mushrooms that grew to a larger size, and maybe they were even put out in an environment where it's got some pigmentation, so they get these brown caps. They just grow, and they found that the workers fought over these, and so they gave them an Italian-sounding name and sold them for a bunch. But they're just the same species allowed to open. You know, this is, you can see the gills completely, and some of these they're typically picked before they've started dropping spores, but that's not important, I think, right now. We cut off there. If you missed something about button mushrooms from the last slide I covered, you know, you're not really out a lot. I was just making fun of portobello mushrooms, I think. Anyways, we're back. These are just a few mushroom pests to be aware of. Okay, this guy right here, trichoderma, green forest mold. This, I would say, is the fear. This is, you missed some sort of step in the sterilization or the pasteurization process somewhere, because this is everywhere, and it just, the environment that mushrooms grow in, this right here, it just swoops right in and takes over. It outcompetes the mycelium, and you've lost it. If you see a green spot, throw it away, don't waste any more of your time. These fungus gnats, these are pretty much always going to be there. You have probably eaten a fungus gnat if you've ever eaten a mushroom. They're part of it. And then these mites aren't a huge problem, but they do cause destruction of the cap, particularly as it's forming, or they can chew and destroy primordial mushrooms, those pinning mushrooms, and then they deform. So if you're getting really deformed mushrooms that have what looks like some physical damage, that's where these mites come from. And honestly, the fungus gnats, the answer some people have is they get some frogs. With the mites, this is going to be cleaning your space in between crops. This is going to be, there are some sprays that are used. One of the things about mushrooms and mushroom cultivation is a lot of it can be really done without the use of any sort of pesticides or fungicides, obviously, or anything like that. So, but this, on the other hand, these are kind of manageable, treatable. This one, though, is just a sign to give up. Okay, so mushrooms are harvested either like this in an automatic way with agaricus, but typically you're talking about grabbing this clump of mushrooms and twisting it off. Especially, that's why I like those buckets, because it was smooth, so they just twisted it right off and they have a smooth back. Or they're cut off, they're cut short, or anything like that. But a lot of labor involved in the harvest there. And then post-harvest, you can have coolers like I did. You can have a walk-in, and then a lot of the large companies, they do a dried soup or a dried mushroom product, or large-scale canning, particularly or industries that already have huge canning facilities for their sterilization of their media. And this is some of the things that I used for all of this presentation. And typically I would see if you had any questions, but if you have any questions, come by my office or send me a message at sdoty@uvu.edu. Thanks.